It started actually probably about 40 years ago. Way back in the 70s, local government was reorganised. Eccles Town Hall had been the centre of the borough of Eccles since it was created in the 1880s. And suddenly, it was no longer. One of 5 boroughs all connected together now in the city of Salford, 5 town halls not needed, new city hall made in Swinton. What to do with Eccles Town Hall? And that's when it really began, because the council, Salford City Council, really didn't know what to do with it. And they continued not knowing what to do with it for many years. It was a financial burden. One option was to pull it down. And I think that really very nearly happened, which would have been a crying shame, because it is a beautiful building. It's not actually listed, although it has apparently, to use the term, special architectural merit, but it isn't listed, which is actually quite a good thing, because listed buildings put constraints on what you can actually do. Anyway, it wasn't pulled down, and then the roof started leaking, and the pigeons got in and did what pigeons do, and the roof space became a complete disaster. And they realised in the 90s and beginning into the turn of this century that if they didn't do something, it was actually going to fall down. So they, about 10 years ago, that sort of period, they made it safe. So it's structurally sound. So here we have a structurally sound building that nobody knows what to do with. Some enlightened councillors said, well, we can't get any money for the hall to be renovated. What for? But if we had a charity, then they can get money from Heritage Lottery, Big Lottery, whatever, which we can't get. And they could do something with it, perhaps. What to do, we don't know. But let's leave it to the gods, so to speak. So gradually, about 10 years ago, there was this feeling that they would begin to renovate the hall with some infrastructure. And the first thing, in fact the only thing that they did, having made the roof safe, was to put a lift in. Because here we are on the first floor, there is no way that any lottery funds are going to come to a place which has no lift, which is on the first floor. It's a complete non-starter. So I don't know how, but they found monies to put in lifts. Lifts are very expensive. Rumour has it was about 300,000. It was very expensive to put a lift in, because it involved obviously not just the lift, but actually replacing staircases and re-engineering the whole area. So that's what they did. And that was completed about 6 years ago. What to do with the building now that it has a lift, with disabled ramp access around the side, etc. So they called a public meeting, and I was foolish enough to go to this, and we were all told that here was this lovely building. We all had a look around it. It was not a lovely building, it was a complete shambles. The plaster was falling off the walls. They had, would you believe, in a short-sighted attempt to find some function for it way back in the 70s, put a suspended ceiling in this beautiful barrel-vaulted hall, which had meant that there were holes in the roof, and they chiselled out where the awful sort of suspended ceiling went into the windows. They'd simply chiselled through the architrave and smashed the wood. Some of the corbelling had been destroyed in looking at the roof to see whether it was fit for purpose, whether it was strong enough. It was, but they removed all the plaster corbelling. So it was a real mess. And so the question wasn't what can we do to actually to bring it back to life, but is it worth doing it? Because it's a complete shambles. Anyway, I think there were about 30 people at this meeting, and it was decided that yes, probably it was worth saving. And so it takes us to about 3 years ago, when a group was formed, and it's absolutely true. I was sitting in a group of about sort of 20 people who had been reconvened to a second meeting, and one of the councillors said, David, we'd like you to be the secretary. John, we'd like you to be the chairman. Paula, we'd like you to be the treasurer. And we had no idea until we were sitting down in effectively a public meeting that we were going to be fingered like this. But we were. And I thought to myself, gee whiz, this is going to be an extra job. I'd got plenty of things to do at that time, still have, without this. Anyway, I thought, well, it's a good community activity. I'll have a go. And so I said yes. It would have been difficult not to have said yes. And the councillor that proposed it knew that it was going to be difficult for the three of us. So we started. And that's how it started. But your question was, how did Echo start? That wasn't Echo because we didn't know we were going to be called Echo then. We had then to think of what we were going to be called. And of course, a name is very important to promulgate your objectives. So lots of thoughts were put into it, and somebody who currently worked at that time worked for the local authority suggested Eccles Community Hall organisation because it had a nice ring about it, forgive the pun, and so that's what it was. So it was born about 3 years ago. And we've had our ups and downs, but it's mainly been ups. We had a few downs to start with because one of the problems you'll appreciate is if you've got a wreck of a building and a group of local enthusiasts who've got no track record of doing anything with such buildings, the first thing, well, there are three things that grant givers sort of ask when they're looking at what we were asking for, which was about 150,000, they'd say, is this worth doing? In other words, does Eccles really need a hall like this? I mean, maybe there are another 10 halls and it's a redundant hall and they can use the other 10. They don't need it. Secondly, can it be done? I mean, has it got to such a stage that our 150,000 would be just like throwing good money after bad, and it would be a complete waste of public funds? And most importantly, can this bunch actually do it? Can they pull it off? And of course, we had to prove all three things. Once you've got your first 150, and that was really difficult. It was really difficult. Once you've got that 150, and you apply for the second grant, then those questions have really already been answered. Yeah, it was obviously worth saving it, and they have done it, and they're clearly very competent because look what they've done. So the question then they've got to ask is, should we fund the next stage? Is the next stage needed, and can it be done? Not can they do it, because we've shown that we can do it. So the second lot of grant that we got, we had to go through a lot of hoops to get it, but it was relatively easy and straightforward. I mean, we had to work hard to get it, but it was doable, and we knew that. The big difficulty to start with were people were asking questions like, well, this is the first of maybe 2 or 3 stages of renovation. When you've done the first one, and as you'll have seen behind me, there's no renovation been on the stage yet. Will anybody use it when there's not a stage here? I mean, it's, and the question couldn't clearly be answered. Well, now, of course, we can, when we ask for money for repairing the toilets or putting new stuff in the staircase or repairing the balcony, if people come and to us and say, well, look, you've got a nice dance floor, but I mean, you haven't got a stage. Is anybody going to use the dance floor? Well, yeah, yes, they are. Here is the list of bookings. And so it becomes a lot easier. So I think that's where we are at the moment. Is that giving you a rough idea of where we're at?
So what's next? What stage are you at now? So you said there's 3 stages.
We've got a big issue with the stage. most people who come into this hall do not realise that our leasehold from the council, which incidentally is a 25-year leasehold, so that was very generous of the council. We've got rooms in our leasehold above the stage which are very extensive, and they've never been used for 40 years, and they are in a terrible state. They're in the same state that this hall was in only 2 years ago. I mean, it's difficult to imagine you sitting talking right now that 2 years ago that nothing had happened in this hall, and 1 year ago we were just getting our first actual booking. So things have happened very quickly. I think they could happen as quickly in the stage, but that's a sort of long-term aspiration. And what we're doing at the moment is getting all the little bits of extras which we weren't able to get with the 2 big grants we've had so far. We've had a lot of little grants which have been helpful, and we're getting a few more little grants. I mean, by little I mean a few thousand rather than tens or hundreds of thousands, to do things like carpeting the staircase. The balcony is lovely. It's a useful facility. Can we actually renovate it? Is that going to make any difference to the fire regulations? Is the banister high enough? And all this sort of thing, these are all very important questions which we're learning we have to be able to answer. So.
And how important has the hall been to Eccles? How is it helping Eccles grow as a town?
Well, I think probably you're asking the wrong person, because naturally I'm quite an enthusiast. I mean, I wasn't born in Eccles, but we've lived here for 30 or 40 years, and so I'm quite embedded in the local community. And as I'm an enthusiast, perhaps I'm the wrong person to ask that question of. But if you ask the average punter in the street, increasingly people are aware that this place exists, whereas the generation which used it frequently for Saturday night dances, for coming to important meetings, film shows, all sorts of things happened in this building. They're getting into their 80s and 90s. You know, and so that generation has moved. So anybody under the age of 50 is unlikely to have been in this building as a sentient adult, because for 40 years it hasn't been used. So you'd have to be a sort of pretty enthusiastic teenager to remember having come here in the 60s and 70s when it was being used actively. So I think, to answer your question, we are getting quite a few younger people beginning to come in here and saying, wow. Obviously the older people are delighted and come in, but they aren't perhaps able to contribute as much because they're getting into their 80s and 90s, but they're terribly proud of it, and it's great for that generation to be able to see that their beloved town hall has actually got a new lease of life. And I think there's a recognition outside Eccles that this is an important place. We think, I mean, I say you're asking the wrong person, because I'm very enthusiastic about it. You need to go and ask people out in the local community if they think it's worthwhile. But I can tell you that, for example, the Lowry think it's worthwhile, the BBC Philharmonic think it's worthwhile, in that both those organisations have a big outreach component to their activities, and that they want to embed themselves in the local community and help, not just be a regional and national high-profile operation, but they have a commitment to their local community, and they're absolutely delighted with this place. One of the things about it, of course, that I hadn't realised until I sort of started looking at it, is that in terms of what are called unique selling points, then no doubt you've heard the expression USPs, we are halfway between big regional centre venues, such as the Bridgewater Hall on the Lowry, and little church halls and scout huts, which are increasingly under pressure from health and safety legislation, access requirements, etc., and have difficulty keeping afloat. And we're in the middle. We're a relatively big hall. We've got a good acoustic. We've got a good floor. When we get a good stage, which I would think is about 3 years off, there'll be no stopping us, because we'll be able to offer a venue which the like of which there isn't in Salford. So I think the local people of Eccles will realise that they have in them, it's not just their local facility, which is now doing well, but actually a facility which will be used by a wider group of people.
And do you know how long has the building been here? What's the history of the building before it became magistrates?
It was built in 1881. At that time, it was built before the Borough of Eccles. I think my history is not very good on this, but I think the late 80s was when the borough was formed, and before that there was a Board of Health which looked after obviously the health, but which was partly water supply and sewage. I mean, that was what health was about, because there was a big problem. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and this place needed a Board of Health. And they had offices which were in Patricroft, which is only a mile away, which were cramped, and they needed something big, and they thought big. And they said, look, if we want something like this, we want not just offices, but we want somewhere where we can hold public events, where we can be proud. I mean, they got all the right ideas. It's just we've got clever words for them these days, but improving social capital. They were into improving social capital, building a place like this. They didn't need it for offices. It was the 1970s which screwed things up. Making this, they actually made offices in this room in the 1970s. That's where the false seal was put in. It was divided into partitions. When my wife came to enroll our kids in the Scouts in the early 80s, she came into this room. She didn't know she'd come into this room, because it was offices with partitions up, and it was just like a boring office. You couldn't see the ceiling. But when they built it in the 80s, in the 1880s, they knew what they were about. So they built it, and within 8 years, they built an extension at the back for the magistrates' courts. And they're still there, of course, unused.
And how pleased are you at the progress that it's made so far, Echo?
I'm very pleased. It's really satisfying to see what's going on. There's lots more to do, and it's really very exciting. And to see the different groups of people coming in here. I think we've still got work to do to get all sections of the local community in. There are some that aren't mixing yet. I think we need that.
And what groups do you have coming in at the moment? You said the Lowry.
Well, we've got regular users, and they will come in weekly for various events. There'll be young people and old people come in, sort of dancing or sitting and talking and that sort of thing. But the one-offs are more popular than we thought. We thought that we might get the occasional one-off event. But we're getting quite a lot of people wanting to. I mean, I've just had this morning a group of university graduates who all play wind instruments, and they're looking around for somewhere in Greater Manchester to perform. Can they use Eccles Town Hall? And it's that sort of thing which is really taking off. So we've had barn dancing, we've had Scottish country dancing, we've had jazz groups, we've had military bands, we've had quite a few choirs. The local Eccles Community Choir. We haven't got Salford Choral Society yet. We're not quite big enough for Salford Choral Society. They'd fill the place with just the members of the choir, never mind getting an audience in, you know. So they need a bigger place. But we've got quite a wide spectrum of groups coming in.